Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yong-Ha Kim. I'm a sociologist from Yonsei University. It is great honor, in fact, for me to be the moderator of this important session this afternoon. And in fact, I have prepared a long introductory remarks to put this lecture and discussions into the context. But President Park In-guk already did it. In fact, much better than I would, and I prepared. So we can now jump into the discussion quite quickly. It is a little bit late than scheduled. So what I will do is to give each discussant 10 minutes for discussion, maximum. And Professor Fukuyama will have another 10 minutes to respond. Then I will open up the floor to take questions from you. But as you can hear, all these discussants are from Harvard University. And Professor Fukuyama is also from Harvard, in fact, when educated. It's all Harvard connection, and University of Chicago is an exception today. So in my mind, there are many questions, important questions, because it is a really important lecture. And one of the questions would be, will this trend a short-term or long-term? And in fact, I asked this question to him before his lecture, and his answer was, it is really hard to respond. But he said he's an optimist, so he will prepare some activism or movements to restore democratic regime in other countries. Another question would be, probably they will discuss about this. Is this democratic recession, does this have common causes? Or is all this unhappy families are unhappy on its own causes? It's from Tolstoy. We can apply the same quotation to this context. Is undemocratic nations are undemocratic because of its own causes, or are there any common causes? And this will be the topic of this discussion. I will give 10 minutes to Professor Lee Suk-jung first.
Okay, I have 10 minutes. I'll try to finish within 10 minutes. It's good to see you, Frank. After you moved to Stanford, it's my first time to see you in person. So it was a great lecture. Actually, when I saw your PPT in advance, my reaction was, okay, I got the material, but what's your argument? What's the cause? But you delivered a very excellent lecture about your deep knowledge about democracy all over the world. I have some comments and I have some questions. One comment is that you showed many data to prove that democracy is in recession for the past 10 years. What is data about stopping stagnation of expansion of democracy as an institution, whether it's electoral or liberal. And second, you show the shortage of freedom scores. And third, very important, breakdowns of democracy in many important countries. So I think we tend to agree that democracy is in recession for the past 10 or 15 years. But at the same time, if we see the graph, actually there is no reverse. It's mainly about stagnation. So I will support your 1989 argument that this modernization trend to liberal democracy is not dead. It is still valid. We are just in a very difficult period. Okay, then you mentioned why there was a successful third wave democratization, and you emphasized the structural force of economy and social very good period, nurturing the middle class, right? Then I want to push you, then why the middle class cannot play a significant role in expanding and upholding democracy? Is it because of, since the mid-2000s, economic difficulty is causing such a passive or even detrimental role of middle class? Then can I say that the current democracy recession is actually reflecting economic recession? That's my first question. And also, when you mentioned about the middle class is not unitary. Middle class is diverse. So if we look at the countries in problems, we saw many middle classes divided by ethnic background, religious background, cultural background, speaking different languages. So therefore, I think we need a more sophisticated analysis about the role of middle class, since they are not unitary force. So I'd like to hear your opinion about that. And you mentioned about the cause of the current democratic recession is mainly about, you mentioned many factors, but in particular, you emphasize state failures. So you are saying it's not a failure of democracy as an institution, it's a failure of a state because they are very weak states or divided states failing to deliver public service, right? So in that matter, I think you emphasized very much about state failure. But if we go back to the divided society, can you say that it's at the same time failure of a civil society? Because civil society couldn't get unified to demand state to deliver such a service. And at the same time, civil society elites are divided, and they just developed power competition rather than sharing power. So actually they destabilize the state as an coherent institutions. So that's my question. And relate to this state failure, actually, is it going back to your question about China? Actually, we can say that Chinese government has been relatively successful in delivering public service and keeping law and order. So you cannot say there's a state of failure. And actually, they have a pretty good governance, right? And you are talking rule of law to attack, to criticize the Chinese political practice. But many Chinese leaders would say that we have rule of law. So their sense of rule of law is keeping law and order and into everyday practice. So in that matter, the Chinese will like to say, we can talk to Western democracy if we agree on good governance, rather than talking about democracy. So in that point, the rule of law interpretation is different between the West and China. And as a consequence, so actually it's very paradoxical. If China is doing good job, actually the prospect for democratization is bad. So if the middle class, Chinese middle class, want to enjoy the material benefit because the Chinese one-party communist rule is delivering economic benefits, why would they want unstable democratization? So that is putting our thesis that actually the prospect of Chinese democracy is not bright. And then can we say that actually many countries in Middle East and other parts of the world, the state couldn't compromise because of these different competing forces? Then can you say that actually Chinese model is not that bad? So maybe state building is first, then they can maybe ask for the democratizations. Okay, I'll just stop here.
Wow, it is very sharp and critical comments. Let me summarize very briefly. Indicators of democratic recession presented here do not really show recession. That's the first comment. And second comment is, what would be the role of middle class? Because middle class is not unitary. Third comment is, it is rather than a state failure, it is the failure of the civil society, isn't it? That's the third question. And fourth question is, the rule of law may be different in different countries. These are the four comments. Very, very critical and well made. Thank you. Professor Lee?
Okay, thanks for having this great opportunity for me. I mean, actually, I went to the college in in 1989 when he published the famous article, The End of History. So as President Park said at his introduction, he's an intellectual rock star, and especially for me, it's a kind of, as if I'm meeting with a kind of a Rihanna in the young generation, or the old generation, I'm meeting with Ringo Starr or something. Okay, since Professor Isuk Jung preceded me, so I lost a couple of questions of mine to her. I still have a couple of questions remaining under my arms. The first one is a little bit theoretical. It was not in the part of your presentation slide. However, you mentioned that a kind of internal contradiction between the generating power on the one hand and limiting power on the other. You mentioned that democracies or the modern type of government has three elements. The one is the rule of law. The second is democratic accountability. Both of them tend to limit power, while the effectiveness of state is more like a kind of the using or the utilizing the state's capacity. However, one of your colleagues at Stanford, for example, Barry Weingast, have been argued that it's more like a kind of limited government or the states with a limited kind of capacity or tend to generate more capability in the long term. So I have to empathize this point. In the short term, maybe there was some kind of introduction, but in the long term, I believe that we have very powerful kind of complementary between the limitation of power and the generation of power. That's my first comment. The second comment is, you categorize kind of three elements of democracy. One is democracy is a kind of a competing at a political competition and electing the political representative. The second is liberalism, which is more like a kind of minority protection of minority rights. The third one is republicanism, which is more or less about the rule of law and the horizontal accountability. However, you fail to kind of match these three elements with the collapse of kind of democratization of the democratic breakdown. You mentioned, you listed the state effectiveness problem and the political parties and the political institutionalized weakness and the corruptions in the political system and the last and the patronage problem. You mentioned that in your book, you mentioned state tended to return to the primordialism in most of the cases. However, in these presentations, there is no kind of match, the theoretical match one-to-one. So I'm just wondering, how would you kind of advance your own argument in more or less a theoretical way? The third one that I'd like to emphasize is this. Maybe this is an answer to Professor Isuk Jung's question, but I'm not here to answer the question. But in here, there is no Samuel Huntington's political parties and the political institutionalizing. You presented his idea in your presentation. However, in your presentation slide, there is no mention about the importance of political parties or importance of political institutionalization. You mentioned that three elements matters in democracy, but there is no political party, political institutionalization. How would you kind of incorporate his valuable and precise idea into your own presentation, your own theory? And the last thing that I'd like to emphasize is this. As President Park said in his introduction, South Korea is an East Asian country, and we are bordered and neighbors with China, a rising China, very powerful China. And most of all, as an international relations theorist and a security specialist, I'm seriously concerned about China's nationalism. Many people in my field, many people in international relations, believe that democracies do not fight with each other, never ever fight with each other. However, democratization causes a lot of instability. Democratizing states or immature democracies tend to fight with each other through nationalism. And a group of theorists believe that China is in the middle of democratization, and its a negative side effect is China's nationalism. In here, if it is correct, then maybe it is kind of brutal way to say this, but is democratic recession always bad? Maybe it is a kind of urge to, maybe it is a kind of way to control China's nationalism, which would destabilize East Asia in a specific and destabilize the international system on a general consensus. And this is my concern, and maybe the last question is too brutal to say this. Maybe this is a kind of politically incorrect to raise this issue. However, as a social scientist, and I believe you are the social scientist, so maybe it is our moral obligation for us to raise this issue. However inconvenient, however politically incorrect. Let me stop here, yes.
Well, I'm a sociologist, and I have hard time understanding comments of political scientists, in fact. But whenever there is a statement about political incorrectness, it is good idea to step out. So I will give a microphone to the Professor Fukuyama so he can understand what.
Okay, so let me begin with Suk Jung's very good comments. So the role of the middle class is very complicated, and as you say, it's not one group, and it behaves differently in different circumstances. So although, generally speaking, rising middle classes have supported democracy, they don't always do it. And I would say that two countries today where they're not doing it are Thailand and China. Okay? The reason that they're not doing it in Thailand, as far as I can see, is that they fear that democracy, meaning one man, one vote, means the election of this populist party, a lot of redistribution that's going to kill the economic model that's made them all rich. And I actually think that that's the way a lot of middle-class people in China think. They think if we in China have an election tomorrow, you could elect a toxin-like person who will, because there's there's hundreds of millions of poor people in China, and if you actually had open political competition, you could get a toxin-like figure, demagogic, populist, that will arise and destroy the kind of both social and economic model that they benefited from. And I think they're probably right about that. I mean, it's a legitimate thing to worry about. It's less legitimate, I think, in the case of the Thai middle class. I think that they should just back off a little bit. But so it's definitely the case that, especially if you have a middle class that is sitting on top of a lot of poor people, a lot of times the middle class actually supports the oligarchy and doesn't want democratization. That was true in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s when a lot of middle classes in Latin America supported the military, dictatorships and so forth. So, yes, so it's a very complicated kind of situation. The question, though, is really, I think, for China, is whether, so China is just not going to do as well economically into the future as it's done in the past 30 years. It's just, there's no way that this can happen. And in fact, so much of Chinese economic growth has been either due to this demographic dividend that they get, or the effect of moving all these peasants, mobilizing peasants, putting them in factories and cities and so forth. That period has completely come to an end. They cannot get further productivity to sustain even 6% growth or 5% growth unless they have total factor productivity, meaning that they actually improve their management practices, they innovate better, and so forth. And I just don't think that they can do this without something that's more like a real rule of law. And that's a big challenge, and I think they may not put all the pieces in place to sustain that rate of growth. And then if the rate of growth really falls, or even if they run into a recession, which they've not had since 1978, what's the middle class going to think then? Because they may not be so supportive of the system if they get into trouble. Now, so you also asked about, don't the Chinese have their own version of the rule of law? So I was just in Beijing, and I spent a whole week talking to both a number of very senior political figures and a lot of academics about precisely this question, because the fourth plenum last year talked about the rule of law and claimed that the party was in favor of strengthening it. So what they've got is what I would call rule-based decision-making at a low level. So more and more economic decisions now come under some kind of, procedural rulemaking. But this is very, very far from rule of law, and even the Chinese themselves, I think, understand that this isn't anything close to a real rule of law. And let's begin with the anti-corruption campaign. So this anti-corruption campaign has led to the elimination of, tens of thousands of officials, but there is no procedural correctness to this whatsoever. An official wakes up one morning, he reads in the newspaper that he's got 3 mistresses or that he's been taking bribes or something, and then he either commits suicide or he leaves office or something, but there's no trial, there's no prosecutor that's actually looking at evidence and so forth. And so the impression that you get is that most Chinese officials, business executives, everybody else they're terrified right now because they do not know what rules they have to follow in order to protect themselves from this purge. And this, I think, is a big weakness of this whole system, is that they don't have anything like a rule of law. They need a rule. They got a lot of corruption. And by the way, I think the degree of corruption that has been revealed in the anti-corruption campaign suggests that they're not that well governed. I mean, the army, from the most senior ranks of the army down to, ordinary non-commissioned officers, people buy their commissions and, they bribe senior officers and so forth. I mean, if we wanted to go to war with China, we should have done this like 5 years ago, because the army would have fallen apart given, these reports of, how bad the system was. And so I actually wonder whether they are as well governed as they're sometimes given credit for. So I think, your other point about whether it's state failure or the failure of civil society. So it depends where. So it is true that in many cases, the reason that you don't have effective states is that people can't agree on what to do. That's the case in the United States. Congress is so polarized between Democrats and Republicans that Congress has not been able to pass a budget since 2008, right? And that's not because we don't know how to pass budgets. We just can't agree on what the budget should be. But I also think that state capacity is something that's not, you can't take it for granted. It doesn't always exist. And not every state failure is the result of not being able to agree on what to do. That Indian example that I gave you is a good case of that. There is not a single person in India who thinks that teachers ought to not show up for work if they're getting paid. Nobody believes that, right? So that's not controversial, but somehow, these Indian governments cannot provide that kind of basic education. So that's not a case of civil society not agreeing on what the policy is. So if I turn to Professor Lee's, so that's an interesting contention about whether limited government, because it is limited, becomes more sustainable, and therefore, so there's no question that there's something to that the exercise of arbitrary dictatorial power tends to undermine itself and therefore becomes hard to sustain. In fact, at the beginning of the unified Chinese state in the Qin Dynasty, in the 3rd century BC, the Qin emperor, the first Qin emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, was so brutal that his dynasty only lasted for 16 years, and he was actually dethroned by some of his own soldiers that were just afraid that they were going to get punished for bad weather or something, you know. So yes, unconstrained power is self-defeating. But it's also the case that you can have too many constraints on power. I've been thinking about this as an American. This is some of the research I've been doing into the causes of poor governance. So the United States in the last generation has its capacity to do large infrastructure projects has eroded. Why is it eroded? Well, one of the reasons is every time a state or a city or the federal government announces a bridge or a dam, well, we haven't done dams in a long time, but an airport or something, you get sued. You know, you get sued by 100 different labor, environment, you know, different kinds of groups that say, no, you shouldn't do it for this or that reason. It goes through this very expensive formal litigation, and as a result, it takes 15 years to do a project that the Chinese will do in a year, you know, essentially. So it is possible to have too much rule of law and too many lawyers. So I think, you know, limitation of power is fine, but you can overdo it. And then political party, yes, you're right, I didn't mention them except when I was talking about Egypt, and I do think that many of the failures, so a lot of the democratic transition failures have been failures of parties. In order to get from a demonstration in the streets that brings down a dictator to a functioning democracy, you need at least two big intervening stages. So first you need political parties. You need to convert civil society groups into an organization that can contest an election. That's what political parties are for. And that's why Huntington thought that they were so important. Yeah. And that didn't happen in Egypt, at least not among the liberals. It didn't happen in Ukraine. It didn't happen in Russia. So many of the failures of transition were the weaknesses of parties. So you're right that that's quite important. There's another thing that's going on, and I think even in this country you see some echoes of it, that people don't like established political parties. They don't trust them. They don't think that a lot of them are legitimate or sufficiently responsive, and they respond either by not voting or by voting for protest parties or, you know, things of that sort. And so that's a different kind of weakness of political parties that I think potentially is a problem. On the point you made about nationalism, I think that nationalism is a mobilizing cause that can be used by anybody, democratic politician or an authoritarian politician, and I don't think that by holding back democracy you hold back nationalism. So authoritarian governments have been perfectly capable of playing this nationalism card and using it to build their own domestic popularity. I think, you know, that's what you know, Putin has been doing in Russia, and I think Xi Jinping has been using, you know, nationalism as well. So I think that if you want to control nationalism, I don't think the first thing I would think to do is to roll back democracy. And I think actually you've seen more nationalism during this democratic recession than you did in the previous period. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have about 20 minutes, and it's time to entertain the audience. I was just delivered about 15 questions from the audience, and I didn't have time to read all this.
Oh, Professor Kim?
Yes?
May I just interrupt for 1 minute?
Okay.
Sorry. If you would allow, before we begin the Q&A segment of this session, let me just announce two very important facts. First of all three Korean professors on the stage are alumni of Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies. They were selected by our foundation and supported for their PhD studies at Harvard and Chicago, so we're very proud and wanted to share with you. 잠시 안내 말씀드리자면 지금 연단에 올라와 계시는 교수님 세 분은 저희 재단 출신 박사님들이십니다. 해외 장학 유학생 출신이신 한국을 대표하는 교수님들이셔서 정말 자랑스럽게 생각하고요. 그리고 잠시 2층 스크린에 보여주실 수 있을까요? And if we can show the audience sitting on the second floor for a minute, the turnout today has been quite overwhelming. And some of the audience is sitting in another hall on the second floor, and you can see them on the screen right now. So thank you so much. And the questions, of course, are collected from both this hall and the hall on the second floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I had some time to read some of it, thanks to you. And I just looked at the affiliation of the person who asked the question. And there is a unique one from Korea Herald reporter, Joel Lee. Most of the questions are from professors or students, but this is a reporter. So let me take the question from the reporter first, so that we can have some coverage, news coverage. How do you address the blatant failure of substantive democracy in East Asia's liberal states, such as South Korea, which stems from authoritarian Confucian culture, despite the existence of procedural democracy? Any close observer, would you recognize that the power of culture exerts a strong influence on institutions, both within civil society and upper echelons? How can we overcome culture? Okay, I don't know if this can...
Yeah.
Would you answer briefly to this, so that I can have some
okay.
time to read another
sure, no.
questions?
So, you can keep the mic. This
Okay.
microphone's still working. Well, the thing about culture is that it's both very important, but it also changes. And it changes with other economic and social developments that go on in the broader society. So if you think about Korea, just think about the Korean family, about, the nature of relations that Koreans have with each other and the way that those have altered over the last 40 to 50 years, there's just been enormous changes in social norms. Not all of them are good. Like a lot of other developed countries, the family is weakened, people make friends in very different ways. In some senses, the old moral system has been replaced by different, more individualistic kinds of behaviors and so forth. And so I think that it is the case that Korean culture is in a process of continual evolution, and that Confucian legacy, still exists in many institutions, but it's also, I think, being politically contested. In fact, quite frankly, I think it's more openly contested here than it is in Japan. I mean, Japan is also very hierarchical, but Koreans get mad at each other, and they yell and they demonstrate and they protest and so forth. In Japan, they're much more passive, and so I think you're not doing that badly overall.
Okay, I will take a question from the second floor, which is not visible from here. It's from Asan Academy, Ha Hyung Lee. She asked the question, is democracy a universal form of the state? If not, why is democratic recession a problem?
Is it what part of the state?
Is democracy a universal form of the state? Universal, is it universal? If not, why is democratic recession a problem? Wow. It seems natural. If so, why has there been more dictatorship than democracy throughout history?
Okay, no, that's a good question. So democracy is not universal. In fact, you didn't have really any democracy anywhere prior to the late 18th century. And even in the United States, which had a constitution that was ratified in 1789, back then only about 5% of the American population could vote, because you had to be male, you had to be white, and you had to own a fair amount of property in order to be able to cast a ballot. And so in some sense, the United States itself really didn't become democratic fully until the 1960s, when finally, with the Voting Rights Act, all African Americans were finally given full voting rights. So democracy, yeah, it's a very recent phenomenon, and I suppose for that reason, we shouldn't be surprised that it has setbacks and doesn't get universalized. I think my view is the Chinese are always having these debates where they criticize universal values, and Americans tend to think that American views of democracy and human rights are universal and so forth. And I guess my view is that they could not be universal in the sense they've always existed in all societies and all places. But I do think that societies evolve in a certain direction, and as they evolve and as people get more educated and richer and so forth, that democracy, the idea of democracy, the idea of political participation, the idea of dignity, equal dignity for human beings, tends to expand. And so over time it becomes a historical trend or phenomena that, in many respects is on its way to becoming something like a universal value. So that's the way I would put it. It's clearly not something that's always existed, but it's also not just a random, funny cultural thing that comes out of a certain part of Western Europe. I do think that it has a kind of universal appeal.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a question from Professor Jin Mi-kyung, Aju University. She asked two questions, but I'll select one. What is the way out of democratic recession? Professor Fukuyama seems to suggest that the strengthening the state or state effectiveness is the way out. How can strong state go along with liberal part of democracy, i.e. strong civil society?
Well, so there's a couple of things of how do we get out of the democratic recession. One answer is that Europe and America have to get their economic engines going again. The United States is getting there. We're actually one of the few advanced democracies that's actually growing, and our unemployment rate has now come down to about 5.5%. Europe has still got a big problem. And part of the loss of prestige of democracy really has to do with the recessions and the financial crises that both the United States and Europe went through. And until those problems are dealt with more effectively, I think the prestige of democracy is still going to suffer. Now, on the question of the strong state, I want to make something really clear. There's maybe using the word strong state is the wrong adjective. What I mean is an effective or a capable state, not a repressive state, not strong in the sense of having a lot of policemen and being able to arrest opposition politicians and suppress freedom of speech. That's not the kind of strength that I think matters. The kind of strength I think matters is the ability to actually deliver basic services, public goods, basic security, education, healthcare, the sorts of things that people vote, for democratic politicians in hopes that they will deliver. Good economic management, economic growth, all of these sorts of things. I think that those are actually better measures of state strength, and if you understand state strength in that sense, then I think it is perfectly compatible with a limited state that is limited by law and limited by democratic accountability.
Thank you. A question from Jamal, Embassy of Afghanistan. he asked, since Professor talked about the world movement for democracy, my question is, who should take the responsibility to promote democracy? Civil societies, the government, individual, or middle class?
Well, I think those groups are not mutually exclusive. They overlap. But I think that civil society is really at the base of it because democracy reflects popular desire for democracy and people's unhappiness at having to live under dictatorship and have their rights violated. So you won't have democracy unless you have a grassroots movement, and that movement is expressed through civil society. And the world movement for democracy are basically activists that are active in civil society, and the governments, can play a role. So governments decide to host the world movement. They can support democratic activists, but fundamentally the impulse for democracy really has to come from the people themselves.
Okay, thank you very much. This will be the last question from the audience, and these two discussants want some time to comment or ask final questions. Oh, you have pressing question? I'll give you one. Okay, yeah, I'll give you a chance. Oh. Okay, I don't think I have yours. This is a student from Seoul National University, Yu Won-sun. You said in the end of history that the end of history will be a very sad time in the sense that what the mankind has been struggling to figure out has been resolved. You also talked about very prospect of centuries of boredom. Do you feel that with the democratic recession, this century will not be as boring as you predicted?
Yes, well, the last couple of years have not been very boring at all with the Islamic State and the takeover of Crimea and all the things that have happened. No, the point I think I was making there was that in a certain sense, if you have a successful liberal democracy and a lot of prosperity, economic prosperity, that by itself is not completely satisfying for many human beings, because human beings are not just about consumption and safety and security. Human beings want other things. They want struggle, they want justice, they want idealism, they want to have ideals that they can take risks on behalf of. And I sort of think that even something like the Islamic State, if you think about why people sign up for something like that, in a certain sense they these young guys that don't have jobs, that don't have really much of a future in a kind of boring European country, all of a sudden they can go be heroes, join up with a big movement that's part of something that's much larger than themselves. And I think that it's that impulse that I think drives a lot of people to be dissatisfied with life in a peaceful democracy. And I think that's something, it's that energy that leads to these extremist political movements, and that is potentially something that could I said this actually even in that original article, that could be the source of restarting history in many respects.
Thank you very much. There must be two pressing questions from the floor. So I'll take just two, and that's it. And I will give 19 seconds for each one of you to pose your question very succinctly. Oh,
okay. Sorry. No, I will be probably shorter than that. Thank you very much for the presentation. I would just like to express to Professor Fukuyama how much his scholarship was a source of inspiration for us in the late 80s and early 90s in Central Europe. I am the ambassador of Hungary I'll just very briefly make a comment, just a couple of sentences in reaction to your presentation about my country. In my opinion, and I'd like to stress this to you, it is incorrect to present Hungary, the Hungarian case, as a case of liberal democratic recession in the world. The government led by Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has been acting on a very strong mandate given it by the Hungarian electorate, actually twice by now already, in 2010 and then 2014. You talked about those major electoral victories there. Since my country, Hungarian democracy, has been scrutinized by influential international organizations, and our democracy has been found healthy by them with all the democratic mechanisms and institutions in place. One other thing for the record, the Hungarian Prime Minister has not advocated illiberal democracy for Hungary or for Hungarians. He just talked about that as one of the models around the world, but it's not something that he has advocated for ourselves. And on the basis of this, you may know, I've been dealing with these issues for a long time. This current government has grown out of the democratic opposition, the democratic movement in the late 80s. Its commitment to democracy, in my opinion, should not be called into question. Thank you so much for the possibility. Thank you.
Can you see him for 5 minutes after the session, individually? Okay. Introduce yourself briefly.
Well, Mohammed Ali Nafti, Ambassador of Tunisia. First of all, let me thank you so much, Professor and Ambassador Park, and all the speakers, yourself, Mr. Wong, for this very nice trip to democracy from the French Revolution till nowadays. You've mentioned Tunisia as an exception, as did Mr. Park. I just want you to elaborate on that. Do you consider that it is a real, a genuine startup of democracy, especially within this political environment in its neighborhood? Thank you so much.
Okay, they're very good comments. I have to give the discussants, each of them, 30 seconds. Okay.
Mine may be less than 30 seconds. Okay. So far, we have discussed authoritarian non-democracies and illiberal democracies. Let's turn to the problems of liberal democracy, including United States and South Korea. Actually, many Koreans are very much disappointed with Korean politics. And then one problem we share with the USA is polarization of political forces. In our case, conservatives versus progressives. And then there's no democratic stability, and also kind of some satisfaction to many the Korean citizens. And what's your analysis about this polarization happening in liberal democracies?
Okay, Professor.
Okay, let me start with your kind of omission of the political institutionalization and the political parties, and because as far as I know, that would be the most effective way to analyze the Arab Spring and its political fallouts. And because under the kind of authoritarian government in the Middle East, and the dictators that did not allow any political parties to organize, and so when they failed, and there was no kind of a political legacy, the liberal legacy to organize themselves, to channel the social interest in the political kind of process. The absence of a political parties, a political institutionalization, undermined the political legitimacy in the Middle East. And so even though the leaders were elected in the democratic ways, however, they failed to build their own institutions to generate effective governance structure and effective state government. However, with your framework, I believe it is kind of tricky to analyze the Arab Spring and its political consequences. So with your framework, how would you kind of explain or predict the Arab Spring? Yes, that's what I want to hear. Yes.
Could you give brief answer to this? Very brief.
Well, so the question about polarization, I don't think there's a single answer. And the answer in the United States is going to be different from the answer in Korea. And one of the things I'm hoping to learn in the days that I'm going to be in Korea is what the source of it you know, I mean, why it's developed the way it has. And we can talk at great length about why it's so polarized in the United States, but that's a, you know, a very complex question. So, and again, on the Arab Spring side, I'm not sure that there is a single answer that actually fits all of the different countries. So Libya, for example, in a certain way had the worst problem of all because there was no state in Libya. And that's what they're suffering from now. They have to build not just democracy and rule of law, but they have to build just a basic state, you know, all at the same time. Egypt had a very strong state. The state, in fact, was a little bit too strong. And as I said, I think there it was a failure of the more liberal groups to actually build cohesive, you know, a single cohesive party that could express the interests of that part of the population. And I do think that Tunisia, yeah, it's a real democracy. I mean, I would congratulate your country for, you know, given how difficult it's been for every other Arab country in that region. I think you've done extraordinarily well in having, you know, free and fair elections and, you know, the kind of results that you have. Maybe I'll just stop there.
Okay, this concludes our session, and it has been a very stimulating lecture and discussions, and let's give them big applause. Thank you very much.